session, we're going to have 4 20-minute talks on behalf of our speakers. And then again, we're going to have that combined Q&A for all the speakers at the very end. For our online audience, again, please try and drop any questions you have into the Q&A option in our Zoom, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. Again, we're probably not going to get to every question, but I will try to get to what I can. And if there are questions that we're seeing a lot of similar questions, we're going to essentially put together a summary question that will get sort of at the root of those. So speakers, remember that Julianne will be doing timekeeping for you, so you'll have a direct line of sight to her right here. So again, most of our speakers for the first 2 sessions will be speaking more about those specific case studies. We do have a little bit of a special topic session that Chad Washburn will also be covering as well with their dune work. So Chad is the Vice President for Conservation for the Naples Botanical Garden. So we're really thrilled to have the garden included. So it gives us a chance to highlight a local connection and show you some work that's happening in our direct area. Chad's going to deliver 2 talks for us to start things out. The first is to discuss a bit about the garden's stormwater management strategies. The second is more of a special topics talk about their work in partnership with FGCU about more resilient dune planting approaches. And this is also work that they've been coordinating with the county, with the city. So Chad will certainly, I'm sure, mention more about that. And partly why we timed Chad's talks together is originally when we scheduled this, we thought that Chad might have to leave a little bit early, but so we kind of just got those scheduled together at the start. Our second speaker is Jenna Phillips. She's a senior director and coastal engineer from the firm Cummins Cederberg. They've been working on some really interesting nature-based and hybrid projects around the state. So Jenna will be able to highlight that. She also brings an interesting perspective around some of the permitting and some of the sort of on-the-ground sort of challenges. And I've been really impressed with their firm's sort of pragmatic discussion about how to actually assess and think about these projects on the ground. And lastly, Thomas Ries is president of Ecosphere Restoration Institute. Tom has lots of practical experience with quite a number of projects, including living shorelines and living seawalls. I was able to see him speak at the Gulf of Mexico conference earlier this year. And, I was able to see some of the photos of those projects in play. And so we're really happy to, again, highlight some of that really pragmatic experience here. So now I'm going to call up Chad Washburn. So again, Chad is going to start us out with 2 different talks. And I think we're ready to, okay.
Right, well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to Rob and Carrie for that great introduction and all the background on nature-based solutions. Thank you to everybody for coming this morning. It's great to be here in front of everybody. There are a lot of decision makers in this room. That's really important. And I hope that you have a great day. And by the end of this, we've got a concerted effort to work together with nature-based solutions to solve some of our greatest issues. So today's speakers will share more about some of the ways that we can use these solutions to address the economic, the social, and the environmental resiliency of our community. And that helps us face some of the greatest challenges that our region is facing. So this morning, I'm going to start off the conversation by sharing some of the ways that we're working on this on stormwater and coastal resiliency at the Center for Nature-Based Solutions at Naples Botanical Garden. And as you listen to each of today's speakers, you'll hear something that is a thread that goes through all of the presentations. And it's something that nature-based solutions share, and that's plants. Plants are primary producers in the ecosystem. They form the foundation for all life on Earth. They lie at the heart of both nature-based solutions and ecosystem restoration. So understanding how they function, how their individual function contributes to the overall ecosystem, to overall nature-based solutions is critical for us to get both ecosystem restoration and nature-based solutions projects done right. And botanical gardens play a significant role in nature-based solutions around the globe. They're great centers for plant knowledge, expertise. Often we include multiple disciplines, and I've shared some of those on the screen, that support nature-based solutions. We also have significant plant collections, which means access to plants for restoration and research around nature-based solutions. We're also viewed as reliable sources and trusted scientific authority among the public and decision makers, and perhaps most importantly of all, gardens worldwide receive more than 500 million visitors annually. That's a significant opportunity for education around plants, ecosystems, and nature-based solutions. So this morning, we're going to talk about one of the most challenging issues facing Florida, both right now and in our future, and that is water. The problem's a really complex one that involves both water quality and water quantity, and those two can play against each other. And that's going to continue to grow as the climate changes, as the sea levels rise, algal blooms become more frequent, and we have more rapid urbanization across our landscape. So we know during the summer months, plentiful rains fall on Florida's landscape. We have a complex network of stormwater ponds and canals that are designed to move water quickly. They're designed to prevent flooding. And they crisscross the state and they lead ultimately to our coastal waters. Of course, the more quickly this water moves across the land, the less flooding we see in our communities. But when water's moved quickly out to the coast, we lose an opportunity for it to recharge groundwater through our porous limestone soils. That's important because most of the state's population, over 90% in 2005, rely on fresh groundwater from the aquifer for drinking water. Another downside of this extensive drainage system is that fast-moving water can pick up pollutants like excess nutrients, sediments, and pesticides. And without an opportunity for these pollutants to be removed through natural processes, which takes time, they're flushed out into the Gulf in our case. So the overall effect of our efforts to reduce flooding, that can result in a loss to what is potentially one of our greatest resources, water. And it can also result in increased pollution in our coastal waters. And we know that some of these pollutants can cause significant water quality issues in the Gulf. Nutrient pollution, especially phosphorus in freshwater and nitrogen in brackish and saltwater, are known to exacerbate algal blooms. Over the past few years, we've seen significant reports of blue-green algal blooms in inland freshwater systems and red tide in the Gulf. In fact, this map, and it's kind of hard to see the points, but the red points indicate, this is just from last week, indicate samples that are high in Carina brevis in red tide along our coast. And you can see around St. Petersburg area, even just last week. So both increases in runoff in pollutants and stormwater are in turn made worse by extensive urbanization and the creation of more impervious surfaces. And this is a Florida map. I'm not sure what 7-Eleven did to get their logo up there, but I couldn't get that off. No pun intended, but this is a growing problem. Collier County's population increased by nearly 6% between 2020 and 2023, adding 22,000 new residents. And that doesn't include all of the tourists coming here. And on top of this, climate change is making all of this worse. We're seeing the effects of this even now. As Rob mentioned this morning, all of the impacts that we're seeing. Due to sea level rise, we're beginning to see instances of sunny day flooding from high tides and sea level rise where there is no rainfall. And those are predicted to increase significantly as the sea levels rise. And when I did the work to find some of these numbers, the numbers are all over the place, but they're increasing exponentially. By 2050, NOAA predicts that we'll record 29 days a year with sunny day flooding in Naples. And that number increases to 99 days by 2100. We're also seeing more intense thunderstorms and hurricanes, which can bring with them increased rainfall during very short events. This summer, 24-hour precipitation records were broken in areas across the state. And we've seen rainfall totals to date well above averages. But that's not to say we won't also see more intense droughts like we saw last summer. But I'll save that for another presentation. So, as Rob mentioned as well this morning, water quality forms the basis for much of our regional economy through tourism, fisheries, property values, and opportunities for access to outdoor recreation. So ensuring that we invest in whatever is necessary to reduce or prevent negative impacts to water quality is imperative for our quality of life. We also know that we'll see significant increases in flooding in the future, and we need to protect our community and our built infrastructure from the devastating impacts of flooding. So you can see there's a really delicate balance here between hydrologic function, and that's that need to move water off of the landscape quickly, and ecological function, that need to ensure that water has a chance to be held long enough so that we can remove potential pollutants and so that we can recharge the aquifer that we need to depend on for groundwater, for drinking water. So as I mentioned earlier, Florida's stormwater systems have been historically designed with the singular purpose of reducing flooding. Their function has been to capture water and move it quickly off of the landscape. This, however, comes again with that unintended consequence of flushing pollutants to the Gulf. And this is a number from Serge Thomas. If anybody knows Serge Thomas from FGCU, there are approximately 10,000 created stormwater ponds in Collier and Lee counties. And most of those ponds look like this. And this is in my own community. So I need to advocate better for this. And in fact, we're planting this summer. They're turf grass right down to the edge. Ponds like this function to slow and hold water, which does provide some function to mitigate flooding, and it does remove some pollutants through sedimentation. However, a pond like this can also potentially act as a source of pollutants rather than a sink for pollutants. When the banks of this pond are mown, much of that cut grass can end up in the lake, and that organic matter contains nitrogen. And that, as that decomposes, it can create anoxic conditions. So we get a flush of nitrogen in the pond, but as that organic matter decomposes, it can release phosphorus from the sediments back into the water column, and that can cause an algal bloom. Over time, that builds up. There's also a significant risk of fertilizer applications to the surrounding turf ending up in the lake. Even though it's not legal to apply fertilizer within a certain distance of a body of water, without any buffer or visual cue, those applications can sometimes be just a little too close. The potential for dry detention areas to be sources of pollution is similar. Mowing areas like this turf grass detention basin, and this is located locally behind a shopping complex, you can see down here in the bottom, that's resulted in a mound of dead grass clippings covering that basin's outlet. The next time it rains, this organic pollution will be flushed out through our canals and ultimately make it to the Gulf. Another issue with stormwater ponds is that they can look like this during the dry season. This local pond is used for landscape irrigation, and every winter it looks like this. The result is this ugly brown ring around the tub as we draw water out of this pond. And when the wind blows across this site, small waves stir up the sediments, and that results in cloudy water and the potential release of pollutants from those sediments back into the water column. And you can see during the wet season, the banks of this pond are eroding from those small waves lapping on the shore. Without plants to hold that shoreline in place, we get erosion, which causes sedimentation, and they're losing their backyard to this. But it doesn't have to be this way. Again, I mentioned we have nearly 10,000 opportunities in local stormwater ponds to address these issues and improve their function. That's 10,000 opportunities. That's incredible. We can improve these ponds' function to reduce pollutants while meeting the need to reduce flooding. This image is one of the garden's lakes before planting, and it looks like what most of our community stormwater ponds look like. And this is what it looks like with nature-based solutions applied. This is the stormwater pond at the garden. So how do we go about this change? By adding plants to the banks of these stormwater ponds, we can increase their function to remove and prevent pollutants from reaching further downstream. Adding a planting of native plants on the aquatic shelf and that transition to upland area, which we refer to that as the littoral zone, can significantly reduce the potential for pollutants to reach the pond's waters from the landscape and to help those that are trapped in the system to keep those trapped in the system. This photo shows one of the garden's primary stormwater lakes. This is a man-made lake that we dug. None of this was there other than there was a small body of water that we expanded, but all of the plantings were done by the garden. A planting like this around a community stormwater pond could help to improve water quality in a number of ways. The buffer planting of native plants between the turf and the pond helped to prevent grass clippings, leaves, fertilizer from entering the pond from that upland landscape. The buffer planting also helps to uptake pollutants and remove them from the water column. A littoral planting also helps to prevent erosion of the lake banks. I mentioned that internal erosion that we get when we get wind blowing across the lake. That's prevented by these plants that are in the pond. And finally, a buffer can significantly improve the aesthetics of a lake bank. And if you do have a pond that has that brown ring around the tub, this can significantly help to hide that. And again, if you have a pond in your backyard, you don't want to see what the picture I showed a moment ago with that brown ring around the tub. So the lakes and the littoral buffer plantings at the garden are just one of our efforts to apply nature-based solutions to stormwater. Our system includes several other treatment wetlands, both dry and wet areas, to help meet the goals of reducing flooding, removing pollutants, and recharging groundwater. And these include the bioswales in our parking lots. If you've pulled into the garden, you likely don't realize the first thing that you see when you get out of your car is our stormwater system. When a drop of water falls on our parking lot, which is our largest area of impervious surface, it flows across the ground and into one of 4 bioswales. And these are dry during most of the year, and they're designed to collect runoff from the parking lot and hold significant quantities of water for short periods of time. They're planted with native species that are adapted to cycles of flooding and drought and require no additional inputs of irrigation. We don't fertilize or irrigate these plants. We treat them like an ecosystem. So most of the rainfall that falls on our parking lot flows into this bioswale, and it holds that water. It takes a significant storm for the water levels to get high enough to move on to the next part of the system. So almost all of the water in our parking lot recharges groundwater. And at the garden's entry, there's another dry detention basin. And I want you to think back to that image I showed of that grass bowl with grass over the drain, what that potentially does to our water quality versus this. This is planted with native plants. This is in the circle drive as you pull into the garden. And it's got some non-native bromeliads along the edge, but it's planted with native plants. And this, again, holds a significant amount of water. So this is more groundwater recharge and water treatment. So it takes a significant rainfall just for any drop of water to make it from our parking lot into our ponds. So we're really working to treat that water. And the largest wetland part of the garden stormwater system is the river of grass. A river of grass is a small-scale wetland, and you can guess that's modeled on the Everglades, and it contains a similar plant palette. By now, you should be getting to see that all of these systems that we're designing, they're modeled on nature. We use the function of nature, of real ecosystems, and we treat them like ecosystems to manage our stormwater. So unless you knew that some of these areas were created, you'd likely mistake them for being natural wetlands on our site. Now, remember I mentioned water quality forms the basis for much of our regional economy. At the garden, we treat stormwater as a resource, not as something that we want to get rid of quickly. The story of water carries you throughout the garden, from the entry wetlands and the parking lot to our river of grass and our large lakes. We treat it like a feature on the landscape rather than a bug. It's not something that we want to hide. It's something we want to showcase. By creating these natural spaces, we've not only improved the quality of water leaving our site, we've also created opportunities for entertainment and education. If you've been to the garden for an event, if you've come to a concert, you've come to a concert that overlooks stormwater. Nowhere else would you go that you would go to a concert that overlooks stormwater, and it's a beautiful view shed. Nature-based solutions that focus on stormwater systems can also provide significant habitat for wildlife. This looks like something we photoshopped with all of this different wildlife. This is a part of our stormwater system. It's incredible. In fact, we've become one of the birding hotspots in Collier County. And this is our newest stormwater swale. This was just planted in 2023. And here's what that looks like now, 1 year away. And this has become a great resource for the community. We've got several landscape architects, we have decision makers, we have the community come out and visit this. It's a gorgeous site, and it's a great opportunity to learn how you can do this in your own community, and it can be beautiful and attractive. One of the other things that we do is we protect natural lands at the garden. So this is the garden. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's the garden. But we protected 90 acres of land at the garden on the coastal side of the garden. And the first step in protecting that was removing invasive Melaleuca. If you had been to the garden early on, this is what you would have seen at our birding tower. 90 acres of land that was overtaken as almost an entire monoculture of Melaleuca. We removed that and we restored this to an ecosystem. This is now a diverse, beautiful wetland, and it's an opportunity for people to engage with nature. There are people out on this birding tower nearly every hour of the day that are birding, they're going for walks. And again, I didn't Photoshop this. This is what that looks like when you get out there. And if you haven't been, I highly recommend. In fact, 3 of the top 5 birding hotspots on eBird in Collier County are related to stormwater. 2 of them are some of our local parks. That's incredible. So those are parks that have planted littorals around ponds and form great opportunities for not only cleaning water, holding water and preventing flooding, but opportunities for humans. So I mentioned saving this natural land along the coast. Every time there's a storm, we collect water quality samples. We collect them before the storm and we collect them after. And each storm, we collect about 100 samples before and after. This is Eric Fode, our natural resource manager. And here's what some of those look like. We collect these before storms that have the potential to have storm surge. And if we do get storm surge, what we do is we sample those bottles for salinity. We want to know how fresh or how saline they are. We get flooding on the landscape, but we don't exactly know if that flooding is coming from storm surge or from fresh water. And that's important for us to know because we want to know how the natural lands are working. We had 8 feet of storm surge during Hurricane Ian. That filled our natural areas. The dark blue areas, that's storm surge water. That's high in salinity. We trapped over 25 million gallons of stormwater in those natural areas. That's 25 million gallons of stormwater in a floodable area that did not go out into the community. That's a significant opportunity for us to reduce flooding and save infrastructure in our communities. The white areas, those are freshwater. That was flooding on the landscape from rains. If we hadn't done this, we would not know where this flooding would have come from. You can see on the north edge and on the east edge of our property, there are blue dots. That's because stormwater flows through the roadside canals. That was something else that we found flooding in the community from storm surge actually came up those canals. So we repeated this summer in our natural areas, and we had another hurricane, and we found flooding. If you've been to our natural areas, this is dry throughout the entire year. We've never seen this flood other than storm surge. So this is a great opportunity in the future as we design or redesign any of our parks, our local parks. We can use this system at the garden, our natural lands, this protected natural lands, to design those parks in a way that we can prevent or reduce flooding. If on 90 acres we can reduce 25 million gallons worth of storm water flooding the community, we can significantly reduce flooding throughout our community. So if you visit the garden for nearly any program, I have to mention education. Our education team, no matter what you do, there's an opportunity for formal or informal education around stormwater at the garden. So for more on the Center for Nature-Based Solutions at Naples Botanical Garden and more about this, please visit this site. We also have a publication in the back of the room on plants for stormwater ponds so that we can impact these 10,000 ponds in Collier County. Thank you. Next speaker will be Chad Washburn. I should have brought a different hat. All right, I'm going to jump. Yeah, I'm going to jump right in so that I can be good on time. So our next presentation will be on beach dunes. I want to share some about Collier County's beach dunes. And several of our partners for this work are in the room, so we'll thank them at the end. But I want to start at the beginning and just kind of define what is a beach dune. It's probably not something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, but it's really a vital part of our community's environmental, social, and economic resiliency. Even when we visit the beach, we often just walk past the dune without giving a second thought. I used to do that. But my goal at the end of this presentation is to change the way that all of us in this room think about this ecosystem. It's important to our daily lives and make everybody an advocate for healthy, diverse, and resilient beach dunes for our coast. So a beach dune is a vegetated mound of sand formed by wind and wave energy along a coast. And they're formed quite often when obstacles like plants trap sand, causing it to accumulate and stabilize over time. And dunes are really one of our planet's most dynamic ecosystems. They're continually changing as they're shifted and shaped by wind and water. So the height and size of a dune are dependent upon wave and wind energy and the availability of sand. If you've been to the east coast of the US, you've likely seen much larger dunes than we have here in Southwest Florida. Ours are typically smaller, but they still play a vital role. They act as a flexible barrier to waves and storm surge, and that barrier protects low-lying coastal areas by reducing the potential damage from flooding and reducing coastal erosion. And I always like to joke that mangroves have the best PR firm out there of all the ecosystems. Ask nearly anybody, even just a visitor to Florida, and they'll say, mangroves protect our coast. However, beach dunes, I will argue, are just as valuable, if not more important than mangroves, as they're often found at the urban interface. Look at a map. Look at where our beach dunes are compared to mangroves. Beach dunes are in front of our communities, our built infrastructure. So it's important that we protect these as our first line of defense against storms. So during storms, wave and surge erode sand from the beaches and redeposit it, sometimes offshore, or sometimes along other areas of the beach or inland, like we saw this summer. Vegetated dunes provide protection against this erosion and some of that loss of sand. They're going to be a challenge when waves are 8, 10, 15 foot high, but on these smaller storms and these unnamed storms, they provide this protection. This dune is on Captiva Island, and it was eroded just after an unnamed storm. But the plants and their roots did their job. They held that sand in place. They protected the inland community. And because these plants are still here, it will be able to recover quickly after the storm. And that's important for us to keep our beaches open. Because beach dunes they don't only protect our community, they form the basis of our economy. The tourism industry is responsible for more than 38,000 jobs in Collier County alone. That's 2019 numbers, and I know it's gone up since then. One of the top things that people do when they visit Collier County, in fact, 80% of the visitors to that survey responded that they go to the beach at least once on their trip. So a healthy and biodiverse beach dune can recover quickly after a storm so that our beaches can reopen and our tourism-based economy can continue to thrive. Our coastline, including our beaches and our dunes, are the economic engine of our region. Community-wide adaptation strategies like dune restoration provide significant benefits in the form of avoided property, sales, and tourist development tax losses, and broad economic benefits to community due to reduced impacts on property and infrastructure. So what are the issues that threaten our beach dunes and in turn, the resilience of our entire community? We've seen more intense hurricanes and unnamed storms as a consequence of climate change. The impact of these storms, exacerbated by sea level rise, can overwhelm dunes' natural ability to recover. And this problem of storm surge and hurricanes is made even worse by sea level rise. Across the American South, we're seeing some of the highest rates of sea level rise globally. And just this year, you may have heard here in Florida, we made the news, unfortunately, not for a good reason. You may have read that rising seas, we had our first extinction due to rising seas, and this was the Keys tree cactus in the Florida Keys. We also have invasive species like beach napaca or scavola, and this can take over an ecosystem, and when it does, it reduces the plant diversity of that system. And that with that lower diversity, we lose that ability of a beach dune ecosystem to recover after a storm. This is a location in Collier County where invasive scavola was removed. And historically, when an area like this is restored, the restoration has been very limited in what we do and unfortunately not very effective. Up until now, this area would be typically planted with 1 and maybe 2 species, and that's sea oats and sea grapes. But we know that a healthy and resilient beach dune, like all of our other ecosystems, rely on plant diversity to be able to function properly. The practice of restoring an ecosystem with just 1 or 2 species limit that dune's ability to not only protect our coast, but its ability to recover quickly after a storm. And this reason, the lack of species diversity in beach dune plantings, it's often due to a number of different reasons, including we're relying on what we've done in the past. We're taking the easiest path, the path that we've known. We've always planted sea oats, and we know that they'll grow. But we miss out on the function of all of those other species in the ecosystem, and I'll talk more about that. And even if we do include other species in beach dune restoration plans, up until now, up until this very moment, very few of those species have been available for use. Currently, more than 40% of the species that should be included in beach dune restoration are not and have never been available in the commercial nursery trade. Additionally, nearly 80% of the species that we need to rebuild our beach dunes are not available in sufficient quantities or the right quality of plant for coastal restoration. That's a significant barrier. But this lack of appropriate native plant diversity is not just a coastal Florida issue. It's a critical national issue. In 2023, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published this report and found that across the country, native seeds are urgently needed to restore ecosystems impaired by extreme weather, wildfires, flooding, and other disasters. So even if we wanted to restore resiliency to our coastline, we face significant challenges in making that a reality. So we're up against a huge challenge. How do we learn very quickly the right steps to make our coastline more resilient and actually put that plan into action? Well, one of the first steps is in identifying the workhorse species. And Mike, if I knew you were going to be here, I would have put you in this picture too. We'll Photoshop you in. There are over 80 species of native beach dune plants across South Florida, and we have limited resources and time to identify those that are really the most important species for ecosystem restoration. So in order to identify those that need to be in the ecosystem, we've partnered with FGCU, we've partnered with Rookery Bay. We've done extensive field work across South Florida, identifying plant species, determining their function in dune formation and stabilization and recovery, and mapping their locations on the beach. And one example of these species is sea purslane. And we found that sea purslane is a pioneer plant species, meaning it's one of the first species that we find in the natural process of building a dune. Where it takes hold, like this one little plant here, it stabilizes the beach, it traps windblown sand, and it traps seeds of other plant species blowing down the beach, becoming a nursery for an entire ecosystem. But you can see this one little plant has created its own dune. And this is a point, this is Murdoch Point on Cayo Costa, and there's sea purslane here and another species. These two species ended up growing over 1 year. We documented them actually closing off one of the passes and building this dune. This dune is less than a year old when I took this photo. I think that's incredible, that engineering power of plants. Those are nature-based solutions, relying on these plants to address our problems. So we found that other beach dune plants perform different functions in the ecosystem. For example, this is bitter panic grass. It's typically found in more established areas and in a mature ecosystem, and it functions much like sea oats. It doesn't recover quickly after a storm like some of those pioneer species I just mentioned, but it's large in size and it has a deep root system. It helps to trap and stabilize sand in our dunes, making them more resistant to damage from storms. But this is rarely included in restorations. Again, I mentioned it's usually just sea oats. So in order to restore resiliency to our beaches, we not only need to determine species' roles in the ecosystem on a day-to-day like that, we need to document how it recovers after a disturbance. So every storm, you will see us out on the beach with our clipboards right away. And this is a plant, oops. This is a plant, this is beach elder, and this is just a few days after Hurricane Ian. This is about a month after Hurricane Ian. Note the location of this plant. That signpost is there. Within a few months, this plant recovered and began a process of trapping sand and building a stable dune. We found that this one individual plant trapped enough sand to build a 12-inch dune at this location shortly after Ian. And since then, we found that beach elder plays a really important role in building dunes. This is after Hurricane Idalia. This is 12 hours after Hurricane Idalia. This one plant trapped over 2 feet of sand. This is like Florida snow. When I looked in my phone under photos of snow, my phone brings this photo up. So looks like snow. It's our version. Hurricane Idalia passed Southwest Florida on August 29th. This is a photo from August 30th. And this series of photos is all the same. The camera just pans a little bit to the right. This is a patch of railroad vine, and it was buried by this storm. This is just the day after the storm. This is what that plant looked like 15 days later. That plant has regrown. It's continuing to stabilize sand. It's starting to trap sand. This is what that plant looked like 30 days later. That's incredible, the engineering power of these plants. Those 2 flowers down there means 30 days after the storm, this plant is producing seeds for the seed bank, for the future of our beach dunes. That's incredible. Now, this next photo is my favorite. This is April 21st, 7 months later. The 2 people standing in this photo are the same height. That plant trapped 2 feet of sand after the storm. We need to include all of the plant diversity in beach dune restoration where we can. It helps to trap sand. Why is trapping sand so important? And this jarring image tells some of that story. You may remember in April of 2023, and this was the right decision to make, $20 million was spent to build an emergency sand berm along Collier County's coastline in an effort to protect us from storm surge in the event of another hurricane. And we had that hurricane. Our community's been addressing coastal resiliency in this way for a number of years. In fact, since 1996, in Collier County alone, on just 20 miles of beaches, we've renourished our beaches with just over 4.2 million cubic yards of sand that's either mined from inland and trucked across the state to our coast, or it's pumped up from the Gulf. That's over 262,000 dump trucks full of sand. And very little of this work included restoration of plants, and almost none of it included the diversity of species that we need. We've had multiple unnamed storms and hurricanes since then, and while the emergency berm saved the county from potentially millions of dollars in damages and helped to keep our beaches open for tourism, however, without the right plants in our ecosystem, the engineers of the dunes, we've lost most of this berm. In fact, since its placement, most of it has been lost to erosion from wind and waves. Plants are vital at holding this in place, and it's a relatively small investment compared to the $20 million that we invest in sand to be able to do this work. So first, we had to learn as much as we could about the plants, their function, and their response to disturbance, but we also had to trial this. We had to put this into practice. So with approval from the city of Naples, and actually in partnership, they were out with us that day helping to plant. We trialed a pilot planting of these diverse beach dune species at 3 locations, 3 access points along the beach. And these were impacted by storm surge from hurricanes, and they performed just like their natural counterparts. They came back after the storm. So going back to that lack of plant material and that National Academy's study that identified the lack of suitable native plant material for restoration, we had to find a way to make a diversity of native dune species available quickly and in large numbers. The county project needed 1 million plants. We needed to collect seeds and small cuttings of species that we identified as important, learn how to grow them, scale them up into the hundreds of thousands of plants, and make them available in nurseries. And keep in mind, many of these species have never been grown in a nursery before. So we had to unlock the best way to learn how to collect just a few numbers of propagules and successfully grow them into large numbers. And this is work we would not have been able to do without partners like the Collier Community Foundation, who supported this work, without our colleagues at Rookery Bay, without our partnership, our research partnership with Florida Gulf Coast University. Those partnerships in our community are vital. So once we collected seeds or cuttings, figured out the best way to grow them, we take them to the garden's bulking nursery. This is a collection called the Foundational Collection, and it includes over 18 species of workhorse plants. And we grow them out in these rows. And then when there's a disturbance or an emergency from that foundational collection, we can bulk up to produce hundreds of thousands or millions of plants from these seeds and cuttings. We can take cuttings of those plants or collect seeds. And then those go on to a commercial nursery where they can be grown into plants for large-scale coastal restoration. I'm happy to say that for the first time, we can begin to address our coastal resiliency in an emergency way very quickly and very rapidly. That's incredible. Throughout this partnership, we've joined the Restoration Seed Bank Association, and that's a national association. So we're not only working locally to do this work, we're working across ecosystems nationwide to figure out how we can build the infrastructure to be able to collect plant material so that we can restore ecosystems like this, like after the fires in Hawaii, after fires out west, after drought, after mudslides. We're working nationally to bridge the gap between the need and the capacity for nature-based solutions. So this coastal resiliency work, along with our stormwater work I mentioned earlier, that's all helps to build a climate-ready Southwest Florida. And that's all part of the Center for Nature-Based Solutions and Naples Botanical Gardens work. Through all of this work, one of our partners is the City of Naples, and this is the Critical Assets and Facilities Adaptation Plan. And this includes several strategies that we've partnered with them on working to build nature-based solutions into the City of Naples plan for our adaptation for the future. And of course, again, I have to mention, one of the keys to success for projects like this is education. The garden's education team schedules programs both in the garden and on our community's beaches to share the importance of beach dunes and the dune plant community with the public. This work supports another objective of the City of Naples adaptation plan on education. So as a community, where do we go from here? Currently, Collier County is planting nearly 13 miles of beaches with just over 1 million plants, and I'm happy to say that they are set on doing it right. That's incredible. They've included a diversity of native species, of locally collected and locally adapted native plant material that are now available for landscape scale restoration for the first time ever. And we're continuing to have conversations with beach dune managers going up north up the coast into Lee County and now Charlotte County, where they too want to restore resiliency to their coast and protect their community. There are nearly 190 miles of beaches across Florida's southwest Gulf Coast region, of which nearly 106 miles are critically eroded. And note, those numbers are from before Hurricane Idalia, Hurricane Debbie, and Helene. That's nearly 190 miles of beach dunes in just our Southwest Florida region that need help, that need work. So we're working hard to ensure that as we invest in rebuilding our beach dunes, we can make this plant material available to do this right. And for Southwest Florida's future, part of our next step as we continue to grow and build this collection of these vital plant species, we're also working to build a restoration seed bank of species native to our most imperiled ecosystems along the coast. It's not just our beach dunes that are being impacted. All of our coastal ecosystems are being impacted. We need to make sure we have the right material to restore our marshes, to restore our mangroves, to restore all of our coastal ecosystems. So here you can see seeds of 2 of the dune species from our bulking facility, and these will be stored at -20 degrees in our restoration seed bank. In case of a disaster in the future, we can quickly respond by pulling these seeds out and immediately having plants available to restore the landscape. One of our next projects will be using seeds like this from species like that railroad vine, that really quickly growing plant species. And we've partnered with the City of Naples. One of the things that we want to do is trial a seed-based planting. Can we go in 24 hours after a hurricane and spread some of these quickly growing pioneer species on the beach as seeds? If we can grow and prepare 1 million seeds of some of these plants and scatter them on the beach, within weeks and months, we might have plants that can trap sand until we can, down the road, plant plants back into these ecosystems. As Rob mentioned earlier, this is our current situation. This is our new normal. This is what we will be doing in the future. So as national leaders in nature-based solutions, we're working to ensure that restoration efforts and nature-based solutions around our community are done appropriately and with the right plants. So as I end today, I'd like to thank our partners in the work. They truly made all this work possible. You can see some of them, their names on the screen. Again, thank you to the Collier Community Foundation, FGCU, Rookery Bay for all of your partnership and work. City of Naples, I should have put the city logo. I didn't, but the City of Naples has been a great partner in this as well. Thank you. With that, thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody coming today. So thank you.
Right. Good morning. My name is Jenna Phillips. I'm with Cummins Cederberg. As Carrie said earlier, I'm a senior director for Cummins Cederberg and a coastal engineer. Been a coastal engineer for about 20 years now, working throughout the state of Florida and in the southeast of the United States. My background is primarily in coastal engineering, shoreline stabilization projects, nature-based solutions, and combining that with dredge material management and beneficial use applications. And so appreciate your time this morning and appreciate being here today. So this is kind of a traditional approach, very familiar scenario here. I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional shoreline stabilization approaches. We see bulkheads and seawalls all throughout the state of Florida. Vertical walls have been traditionally used to stabilize shorelines to protect from wave energy, storm surge, tidal flooding, and all of those things that we're very familiar with and accustomed to here in Florida. So the upside to some of these more traditional applications is that they're easy to permit. In fact, there's actually at the state side an exemption that allows you to easily replace or enhance your seawall within 18 inches of the existing horizontal location. There's a known installation practices. We've been doing this here in Florida for over 60 years. So it's kind of a rinse and repeat type of scenario. Contractors are familiar with how to install these types of applications, and they're relatively, considered to be relatively low maintenance. The downside, I think we're becoming more and more familiar with the downsides of these as time goes on and we experience each passing storm, just like as we saw in the last months. They are expensive to build and maintain. There's a lot of upfront costs associated with them. They do tend to reflect wave energy rather than to dissipate it. So we get that scouring at the base of the wall, which results in a lot of downdrift impacts to adjacent properties, such as the erosion on your neighbor's shoreline. They can be unattractive, like this photo. Anytime we do have an instance where the elevation of the wave crest exceeds that of the wall, then you tend to get that backwash from behind the wall, and then the trapping of water, which collects other debris and things of that nature. And they disturb habitat. So I know most of you in the room are familiar with seeing these, so just kind of want to set the stage here. So we've gotten a little bit better as time has moved on, although we still have some work to do, right? Especially in the context of resiliency, when we think about improving resiliency, and our shorelines are our first line of defense in doing so. And our future, no doubt, is going to continue to be wet and stormy. And so taking this balance of resilience with the ecological and environmental enhancements and maintaining that public access or access to the water is going to be an important component in that upfront project planning. There are a series of funding sources to kind of salient that point to really emphasize and draw a little bit more energy to folks looking away from traditional approaches and more into these hybrid and more green solutions that you see in the middle and to the right-hand side of the schema at the bottom. And the reason for that is to kind of really to support, even on the state side, in the latest statutory requirements from the Resilient Florida Grant Program through FDEP, which encourages local governments and communities to create a flood vulnerability assessment that looks at coastal scenarios that include tidal flooding, sea level rise, rainfall, and the combination of those. Within that statutory requirement under Section 380 of the O93, it defines what critical assets are. And within that list of critical assets, DEP actually defines shorelines as such. So there's a lot of political and funding, and financial backing to these new approaches and the commitment to effecting change, if you will. But as I said, the challenges are we'll get into here as we navigate some of these case study projects that we'll look at throughout this presentation. So there are lots of different applications that we're seeing, especially in recent years with the rise of a lot of the 3D printed solutions. So these are some really great applications where space is a constraint, or if you have an existing seawall, like a vinyl wall that is otherwise devoid of habitat, these can create some great interstitial locations for little critters to live and thrive. And on the next slide, these are some examples where maybe space is available. You tend to see this a lot for oyster restoration projects, anything from your natural riprap in the upper left-hand photo down to some plantings, as you saw Chad just walk through, as well as some prefabricated modules that you see on the right-hand slide. So in kind of putting this presentation together, one of the great resources you might check out is NOAA's Living Shoreline Inventory. They have this throughout the country, and they divide it in various regions throughout the country. So the sample of the photos you see here, in many cases, what we're showing, what we're seeing through the course of these pilot study projects that we've done over the last decades is areas where there is quite a bit of space available. And so what this amounts to is that, in fact, what we're seeing a lot is environmental enhancement projects, not so much shoreline stabilization projects. And so I think there's sometimes a little bit of confusion about those two terminologies. So environmental enhancement includes restoration of seagrasses, salt marshes, mangroves. They often are designed not necessarily to protect anything on the upland side as far as infrastructure goes, They're commonly constructed in mild wave climates or enhancing existing soft shorelines, and they may or may not help with reducing and attenuating wave and storm impacts. It really just kind of depends on the project and site application. So what do we do when infrastructure is at risk? How do we merge these two concepts, right? This need to be more resilient in our coastal areas, but recognizing some of the limitations of the traditional living shoreline approaches that we see that are often environmental enhancement projects. Well, there's a lot more emphasis on what goes into establishing that design criteria and what we expect to see on the performance side. So that need for the engineering of these types of projects becomes more into focus here. So if we're not utilizing walls and we want to move away from those, then what other options do we have at our disposal? So here you see in a project, one of our projects here in the islands, where there's heavily armored, of course, in combination with some natural beach type restoration, but using more traditional combination of rocks, blocks, gravel, combined with vegetation to create that hybrid solution is something that we've been focusing on. So we'll cover some project examples here. So some of the design considerations that we specifically want to look at, of course, wave climate, the tidal scenario, storm surge, and the degree of vulnerability to storm surge, currents, wave loads, and the hydraulic stability. So site selection becomes very critical when we talk about looking at these types of applications. And it just so happens that living shoreline and nature-based projects are often seen on public properties. Public properties happen to be the ripest areas for these types of notable projects. And so that's a great opportunity for the folks in the room to really lead and pave the way for private property owners. In many cases, there's a lot of private property that's owned along the waterfront, and maybe some of which are owned by large, on a large scale, such as golf courses or condominium associations. So these projects end up being placed and installed along rights of way, street ends, and waterfront parks a lot of times. And some of the things that we need to take into consideration is the use of the upland space, how much space is available for your project, what's the length of the shoreline that we can develop and enhance, is there presence of existing marine resources, and we'll talk about why that's important as well as the water depth and wave exposure. Water levels also is a major component. Of course, when we talk about vegetation and different types of plants, we need to understand what that tide range should be and select the appropriate plants to create a layered approach. As you see here in this cross-section view, we've got the upper slope here, that coastal high marsh, the mid-marsh with sand cordgrass and marsh hay. And then as you get to the lower levels that receive that periodic inundation, you want something that's a little bit more tolerant in those conditions. And so not only are we looking at today's scenario, we're also looking at future water levels as well, right? So taking into account sea level rise out to those planning horizons, whether that be 2040, 2050, 2070, 80, and out to 2100, depending on your project. So here's the challenge. As I said, we're getting better at this, but we still have a lot of work to do. And the state and federal regulations have made great strides in recent years. However, there's still some growing pains we come across on a project-by-project basis. So some of you may be familiar here with some of the more easy button permit opportunities available for living shoreline and nature-based type projects. And that is included here in Chapter 62-330.05 for shoreline stabilization, where you can permit a living shoreline under an exemption so long as it meets these criteria. So it must be mostly native plants. It can include oyster reefs, water logs, rock and sill breakwaters. However, those projects cannot extend further than 10 feet waterward of the mean high water line and generally cannot exceed a length of 500 feet. So there's some limitations on how much we can do. But when we think about this in terms of resiliency and the large scale need we have and the critical infrastructure we have on the upland side, we need to kind of start thinking a little bit outside the box here. And what we tend to find is that a lot of these nature-based and natural living shoreline type projects are grant funded Well, what does that mean when you have grant funding? Usually there's a ticking clock, right? And so we find ourselves as engineers and planners and scientists trying to find that balance between having the funding available and doing your project within those grant timelines, but being up against the clock in terms of the permit process. So that usually governs our permit strategy and ultimately our design sometimes. So we really need to kind of have these hard conversations about how can we do more and break outside of these boxes. And I think we'll talk about that further in some of this panel discussion as well. The other thing that these exemptions do is limit pretty significantly the amount of fill we can do, and for good reason, right? Back in the 50s and 60s, we were willy-nilly filling waters of the state, and so there's a reason for these laws and rules. However, maybe looking at them from a different lens is something that we've been talking to the agencies here about in some of our recent projects. Other general permit easy button options, for example, exist for oyster restoration as well as environmental enhancement projects. If you don't meet any of these easy button permits, you get an individual permit, right? And so then the time clock is a little bit more extensive. The beauty in these exemption options is that usually you can get your permit in less than 6 months. If you go through a standard environmental restoration resource permit, you're looking at a year, 1 to 2 years, depending on the project scale. So challenges. What this means is that the state has a preference for doing upland excavation, right? And working above that mean high water line, unless you're going that individual permit route. And so, as I said before, a lot of times we have these public park spaces that are the ripest for these types of larger scale living shoreline and nature-based applications. However, these local governments also oftentimes have codes and policies that are a no net loss of public land, right? We want to preserve the public use of the land. And so therein lies that kind of squeeze that we see. We see the coastal squeeze, right, in the traditional sense that we think about with vegetation, but also just in that limitation and restriction of space. And for living shorelines to thrive and nature-based projects to thrive, we really need space, right? A lot of times when we engineer a stable shoreline, you're looking at a slope that usually we want to see at least a 1:4 to 1:5, which means that for every 1 foot of vertical change, we need about 4 to 5 feet of horizontal distance. Something else to consider when permitting and planning your project is, what types of plants to choose, right? And oftentimes, especially in Back Bay areas, we really like to use mangroves because they do such a wonderful job of dissipating wave energy. They stabilize and hold the shoreline, help to continue to build it up and reinforce it. However, mangroves, even if planted right along the mean high water line, can trigger sovereign submerged lands challenges, which puts you into, again, lots of discussion with regulatory agencies. There are 2 ways that mangroves are regulated. One is through the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, and the other through that ERP process. If you're permitting the project under an ERP, then the mangroves get kicked out of the Preservation Act, which leaves them sometimes in a little bit of a regulatory limbo, and we'll look at that in a couple of project examples here. So moving into a couple of case studies here, this is a project that we've been working on in Jose Marti Park for the city of Miami Beach. This project is located between the Miami River you see on the left-hand side and Little Havana, which is a smaller disadvantaged community. The project does provide open space, lots of social services here as well. You can see the photo on the bottom left provides just kind of a standard scenario. You've got a pretty urban park location with some flooding on the backside of that very low-lying wall. And this is just a normal kind of sunny day flooding king tide scenario. Thank you. In the design of the Jose Marti Park project, we used a layered approach, looking at a combination of mangroves, marsh grass, and buttonwoods. It's important to note that this project area did not have any resources. The water quality in the Miami River, I don't know if you're familiar, but it's pretty yucky, to say the least. And so even with that having been said, no resources, we came up with living shorelines that's circulated here in red, along with a host of other project improvements, such as incorporating a floating dock that would serve as wave attenuation and also a landing location for water taxi. However, this project still took 4 years to permit through DERM and 2+ years to permit through the Corps and FDEP. Another example here in Curry Park, we're moving over up further the coast. This is for the city of West Palm Beach. They received just under $17 million of grant funding for this nature-based project. The photo in the upper left was the existing condition, where again, we have a bulkheaded shoreline with some very mature mangrove planters that they created, but nonetheless a hard edge. The image on the right is kind of the softening concept that we had developed. The similar issue here, where when we submitted the permit application under an ecological enhancement project through the ERP process, that kicked these mangroves out of the Mangrove Trimming Act. And what we received was a host of different permit conditions, as if we were actually impacting these mangroves, when in fact we were looking to relocate them and distribute them in addition to planting additional new ones. And so this wasn't in fact a mitigation project, right? So there's a lot of dancing with the agencies and training of some of the newer staff there that to get this project through the permit process. It's now in the contractor selection stage, so we're happy to see that. Another project here on our west coast in Manatee County, this is Port de Sueño Park. On the left-hand photo, you can see an existing deteriorated bulkhead in the 1960s era. This is a relatively low energy area adjacent to the Palmasola Bay, where we are proposing to remove that existing wall. We do have the upland space available, so we're pulling that shoreline out about 20 feet actually, so we don't fit that easy button permit condition. We wouldn't have fit that anyway, even if we were looking to stay 10 feet, because of the way the rule is written. This is not considered an eroding shoreline, even if the bulkhead is falling into the water. Because the bulkhead is there, it's not eroding, right? So this project is great. We're looking to do some layered planting approach. And I'm rushing here. Dinner Key is another project for the city of Miami, where we're looking at enhancing several existing spoil islands that were dredged for the Federal Navigation Project. You can see that image in the upper left is one of the 5 islands that's pretty well inundated under king tide scenario. This is a 600 slip marina located in downtown Miami that was fully destroyed during Hurricane Irma. They received about $18 million, I believe, from FEMA funding to restore and replace the docks as part of a phase 1. And then the creation of this environmental enhancement and storm surge protection project is part of phase 2. We have completed the concepts here, and that's under review of FEMA right now. But their charge is to ensure that that marina is protected for the 100-year storm surge condition. So lots of analysis has gone into the numerical modeling. Of course, engineers, we like to do numerical modeling to look at the crest elevation, wave climates, water depths, and so on. But similar scenario here, because we have the presence of quite a few seagrasses, we have competing resources, right? And how do we prioritize one over the other? And so what you see here on the slide is a host of different solutions that we intend to include here for this project. Just one last project here in the city of Miami Beach actually did a really cool thing. We've been working with them to develop a living shoreline inventory, or a shoreline inventory, if you will, where they looked at all of their shoreline segments throughout the city, identified a total of 118 segments, and we went through and prioritized those segments to see which ones are best suited for enhancement or living shoreline or a softening approach. And so we created a living shoreline suitability index, if you will, for all 118 of those. And through that process, selected 10 as priority projects. One of which here you can see is along a high traffic road, which is otherwise an evacuation route, so a critical asset by the state's definition under the VA requirements. Very little upland space to grade and pull that shoreline back, right? It's a busy waterway here, so this is about 600 feet of shoreline, so again, kicks it out of that easy button option, but we're coming in here, and this is the current plan to bring in some additional plantings, extend that shoreline out, create a buffering for the upland road, doubling that public access with the boardwalk to serve as also a wave attenuation, and blending those things to create a better park experience. So some key takeaways. I know I threw a lot at you here this morning, but some things to kind of think about. We have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, right? And it's going to take a multidisciplinary approach with your planners, scientists, regulators, your engineers, right from the start of the project to understand what are the primary goals. Is it an environmental enhancement project, or is it a shoreline stabilization project? They're not synonymous with one another, right? And what's on the upland side that we're looking or aiming to protect? Identify the co-benefits up front. That's going to help you in those hard conversations with the agencies in that permit process. And just know that it doesn't require an engineered approach for some of these projects, not all, right? There is no one size fits all type of project in these applications where you have a lot of dynamics at play. And then again, don't forget to consider those future conditions, right? Looking at the future storm surge scenarios, future tidal levels, and so on. And then understand your constraints, lack of upland space, how are we going to address that? Make sure to understand the regulatory rules, working with your consultants or folks within your own city municipal departments, and understand competing resources, right? Seagrasses versus mangroves and so on, and help to prioritize those for your project based on that bullet number 1. What is the goal of the project? So I always like to say this is for the engineers in the room, we'd like to draw with straight lines. And so don't box yourself in, right? Don't draw with straight lines, get creative, and think outside the box. And thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning. My name is Tom Ries. I'm president of Ecosphere Restoration Institute. We're a nonprofit organization, been around for 22 years now. And what I'd like to do today is talk about living shorelines, right? To continue the story, because there's a lot of good information that was presented already, but do they hold up, right? When I talk to people about taking out their seawalls or potentially doing a living shoreline, we tend to have the question, well, do they really work? And so it is a good question, because we work with some really good coastal engineers, but they're doing their best. They're modeling, they're putting the right material in the right place, but do they hold up when we get real storms like we recently had here, both with Hurricane Helene and Milton 12 days apart? So there are a number of projects I'd like to talk about. First of all, if you're going to be in a small little quiescent area, let's do this. Like this Girl Scout camp here on the Bradenton River, where the small word camp is, you can see a little area there that had a seawall. There's no need for a seawall here. Even a biologist like myself can tell you what to do to restore that. Okay, there's no major energy. There should have never been one built there. But there was, and this is what it looked like. And when it's failing like this, the Girl Scout camp doesn't have money to replace that. So we worked with the Sarasota Bay Estuary program, came in and said, look, you don't need a seawall here. And we just took it out. But the bank at 4-to-1, like Jenna said, you want at least a 4-to-1 slope and plant it with native plants. Okay, the plants are what's holding this. There's no real energy here. And to this day, which is about 18 years ago, this is still looking healthy. The mangroves are bigger, but it looks completely stable and it works. So in these type situations, it's not a problem. Now, and when you're getting a little bit more energy, then you need to bring in the engineers to help you. Okay, so this is a Blackburn Point. It's in Sarasota area, and from the south, it's getting a lot of wind erosion. So we knew we had situations there. They put core logs in and plants. That didn't hold. So we knew there's going to be something that's more stable. You're going to have some material in there. I worked with the coastal engineer. They did a coastal condition analysis and determined that oyster bags could work, but they only weigh 35 pounds, and they really need something at least 50 to 60 pounds. So they were designed it with really small oyster domes. But Sarasota County has a rule in their comp plan, there's no fill allowed in the bay, which is a great rule to have, except it should have variances or exemptions, which it doesn't. So we couldn't put it in. And this is what was designed by an engineer. So he said, okay, we'll do oyster bags. You know, we don't think it weighs enough. We'll try and put them in. And we put them in. And this is the drawing on the left where you can see it's just oyster bag array out there in front of the mangroves. And they look really good when they go in, okay, no big deal. And then we had a storm, and we're not talking a hurricane, just a small storm came through, and the bags just got tossed around like they're nothing. Okay, so that's a problem for folks of us that are trying to put these projects in when you have regulations that don't make sense, right? We really need to change stuff like that. You got to have a variance system. I understand why you don't want to fill the bays like we used to, but if you can't put in the right solution, we're going to have sites that fail, right? And that's the last thing we need is failing living shorelines as our poster child. We need to have sites that actually hold up. So for a lot of us, we know all these stats without even having to look up here. These last two hurricanes were monumental for this west coast of Florida. Just for example, in Clearwater, the highest tidal surge was back in 1993, and that was 4 feet. So you can see how much we had up in that area. The reason I have these highlighted is each storm had its own wind, energy from the south for one of them and the northeast from the other. So if you were facing any from those, that's where you got hit. Definitely you got energy and those things. So what we did is I've done a lot of living shoreline projects, and I just picked here 7 of them in the Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay region. And all of those have been in the ground just real frequently, I mean, recently, or for many years. So we went out right after the second hurricane and started driving up to these things and say, all right, what do we have left? Is there anything left? And if so, let's get some photos of these sites. So we're going to start up here on the very northern park. It's called Ozona. It's just a tiny pocket park on the edge of a road, and it has a retaining wall because the road's so close. But Pinellas County wanted to do something than just a retaining wall with some riprap in front of it. Although that was holding fine, it just didn't have any ecosystem services. So it was a real simple plan, put in some oyster bags out there. Coastal engineer did look at this site, and because even though it's sitting on the Gulf of Mexico, there are some barrier islands off a ways from here. So oyster bags, some oyster domes, and plants, because there's no plants in there at all. This was the site about 6 months later. You can see the array of oyster bags all lined up. The oyster domes are off to the left. There's just put in at the openings. And we planted the Spartina, simple, just Spartina alterniflora. And it took. We had no plants in there at all. And so they started growing. This looked again even later. You can see how well they coalesced. And so this is what it looked like before the hurricanes. That's what it looked like after the hurricanes. Really no damage. I mean, there's some less plants which will grow right back again. I walked along the outer edge there, all the oyster bags held in place. So this particular site did well, and this is facing to the west. So it didn't get the full brunt of the storms, but it's sitting on the Gulf of Mexico. So I call that a success. You have to pick up some trash. And if you wonder how high the water is, that rail right here, on top of that rail, we have this informational signage up there. And you can, if you look at it closely, you can tell that sign was underwater. And all you had to do is turn to the right where people's houses were, and there's 4 feet of water in those houses. You know that place got hit, not only with waves, but with high water. So that really showed well for the site. We're going to go further down the coast a little bit. This is Felipe Park. It's in the upper part of Tampa Bay. So that got one of the highest parts of the tidal surge. There's 2 areas here that were designed. One on the southern tip where we just used oyster bags. These oyster bags are always put in a nylon plastic bag, which we don't like using plastic. So we tried these new bags that are biodegradable. The problem is they degrade too quickly. And so we did have some issues with those bags degrading quickly, but the oyster bags and the oyster material stayed in place. And this is what they look like a few months later. After the storm, they got impacted though, because it's just the oyster bags and they were not in bags anymore. But around the corner from this area where there's higher energy, the coastal engineer recommended these oyster domes. And these oyster domes were put in literally 2 weeks before Hurricane Helene hit. And this is the after. Happens to be low tide. They didn't move at all. Okay, they totally protected it, that they've got the right weight, the right orientation, and the right location of these, and totally protect the shoreline. So again, we're very glad to see this result. Now we're going to go further down in the upper part of Tampa Bay. This is Safety Harbor. That's where the arrow is. As you zoom in, you see that outer white line. That was the old seawall. And the city had full intention of taking that seawall and replacing it with another seawall. There was a seawall. That's what we need to have. I was able to convince them that there's other alternatives. Even though there's 5 miles of open water fetch at this site, which I consider medium to high energy site, this site could be done and protected without a seawall. And you can see the seawall is in bad shape, and you can also see the pier behind it. So this is the look of the design. So the design was cut that seawall down. Don't rip it out, but cut it down to the mud line. Then you can put oyster bags on that old seawall footprint, put rock behind it because it's high energy, and then plant it. That's what it looked like a month after it was done. You can, if you look closely, you can see the oyster bag array on the bottom, sitting on the old seawall foundation, and there's rock, and then another shot from the shore. The plants are starting to come in real nice. But then we had Hurricane Ida a year later. Now, that put a 4.5-foot tidal surge in. And the picture up on the upper left, you can see the banks totally fine. The rocks held, it did exactly what it's supposed to. Above it, the sod and the plants got impacted, but you can plant them back. And that same white fence in the upper picture is here. And you can see how much energy it was taking the panels out. That's how much energy was at this site, but yet it held. But how did it do after Helene? Okay, that was a little bit bigger storm. Well, it held, upper left picture. If you look in the background, the old pier, it didn't do so well, right? There's nothing left of that pier. That just shows you the amount of energy that came in here. 6-foot tidal surge, record high, never been recorded in this area that high. And yet the living shoreline held. And so these are the type of pictures we need to show people, because if it's designed by a coastal engineer and properly designed, they can hold up, even in major hurricanes, 2 in a row on top of each other. Let's go further down. This is down at Eckerd College. It's in the Boca Ciega Bay. We're going to work on putting a living shoreline in there. There's 2 seawalls in there. The one where it looks kind of orange, the roof of that building looks like a U. Right there is kind of protected on that creek. And so we could, again, take the seawall out. Although there are superstructure and infrastructure next door, there was enough room to do that. So we were able to cut the seawall down, not completely, because there's a lot of oysters and we couldn't put any material in the water, which we would have liked to do within 10 feet, but there was resources there. So we just cut the wall down. The sidewalk was really low. We brought it up to the recommended elevation to handle sea level rise through 2060. And these were put in. We had the students put these plants in, all got planted, looked good, but within 2 months, we got these storms. And it held. Now we'll see there's erosion and some impacts to plants. That was due to the higher sidewalk, and it was a little steeper than 4-to-1 slope there. And so we got some erosion. You can see how that came down into the plants. We came back 2 weeks ago with the students and replanted the whole thing. And so had that not been so freshly planted, we think we would have had no erosion, and it held. So another example where these storms have major impacts, but if you design them right, they can handle sites like this. So this was the replanting that was done, like I said, not even 2 weeks ago, and put those back in, and we should be fine for any future storms. All right, going up into the middle of Tampa Bay. Now this is an 8-foot high escarpment. Okay, so obviously this has high energy. This is 9 miles of open water fetch right on the bay. So that's not surprising to see something like that, okay? Because this was all man-made fill a long time ago, and they built houses on here, and the northern tip's a park. So the county worked with some group that said, hey, we have a solution. We can use these bags here. They're Envirolock bags, and I've used them. They work very well, and we've actually used them on some creek erosion beds, and they work. And so you look at them, you go, wow, it looks like it's going to hold. Spoiler alert is the rocks behind at the house behind there. They have those rocks there for a reason. This wasn't even a hurricane, and this is catastrophic failure. Again, these are not what we want to see here. So the county finally got it right, and they hired a coastal engineer to come in, and we worked with that team. And what they said, what we need here with this kind of energy, you need breakwaters. You can see the line of breakwaters out there. That used to be the old shoreline before it got eroded. And each one of those are out there with rock. And then even in the openings, we need to put rock on the shore. This is too much energy. Just think that you can put some bags in there with some plants. It's not going to hold. This is what it looked like 1 year past. You can see how well the plants are doing, the breakwaters are out there, the shoreline's holding, mangroves are even starting to grow within the rock, doing really well. Then it got its first test, and that was a smaller hurricane, and it had no issue. But then it got it real, this is the real test, because this was after Helene and Milton. And this is facing where the winds were coming from. And when I was driving up here, I was wondering what we were going to see, because it got walloped hard. But it happens to be a low tide, but look at none of the rocks, none of the breakwaters moved. The rocks on the shoreline, whoops, are still in place. And if this is the private property next, and that was a dock, all there's left is piling. So you can tell there's a lot of energy that hit the site, but yet it did well. The only erosion at all was coming from the upland parking lot area, and it took out brought some sand in there, but no other impacts. Now, to the north of this, where they stopped doing this, major impacts. So we know these work, and I was very glad to see these. I only have a couple more I want to show you. This is on the Manatee River. Again, this old falling out seawall, the city of Bradenton Beach was going to replace it. We said, look, there's funding for living shorelines. There's no funding for replacing your seawall. So we help you get the funding. Can we put a living shoreline in? And they agreed to do that. And so we got the funds for them, and they put it in. And so that we have oyster bag arrays out here in front, and then some oyster domes in the gaps, because it's on a river. It doesn't have as much like Tampa Bay type wave energy, but there is wave energy here, and there's planted. And then again, this was another recent one. It was only in place for about 4 months before these hurricanes hit. And this is afterwards. You can't tell, right? There's nothing left. If you look real closely, a few plants didn't make it, but we're going to replace them. But these do work, and they don't have to be a wall. And the advantage is you never have to replace them. A seawall you will be replacing, and it's super expensive. Every one of my living shoreline projects, and I've done 53 of them, every single one was cheaper than putting up a brand new seawall. So they're all different. Like Jenna said, one size does not fit all. Each side is unique. You got to do it, assess it properly to come up with the design. All right, this one, last one I talk about here is Bayfront Park in downtown Sarasota Bay. It looks like up here where the symbol is up there. Oh, it's pretty protected, but down here, there's an opening between the islands. You can see that opening in this old postcard picture. So if the winds are coming from that way, this site's going to have energy. And it did. This is just a tropical storm in 2012. You can see how the impact it had here. The sidewalk was 10 feet wide, was undercut and lifted because of this. You can see boats sitting on the shoreline. So we worked with the Sarasota Bay Estuary program and said, look, we got to do something here. We should get a coastal engineer, but they didn't have the funding. We said, look, let's just put some signage up and with some pictures and plants, and then see how it does. All right, that's what it looked like before. We planted it. Put the signage up, it's held up for many years. Hurricane Irma came through. That was a big hurricane for this area. Went out the very next day. No real impacts. It really held up with just plants. But when we had this hurricane, there's no plants left, okay? This site really needed to have some protection in front of it, but the plants couldn't handle it. And you can tell the energy. Our sign is gone. Happens to be a new boat parked there on the sidewalk now. Again, that just shows the kind of energy that's here. But these do work. This does need to have a second look at it. But Again, these do work well. And so I just wanted some of the objectives. What were their project goals? We want shoreline resiliency. We also want upland adjacent resiliency, but we definitely want shoreline. They're a one-time fix. Why do we do it? Because we don't want to come back and do it again, right? If they're designed right, you won't have to come back and do it again. Where benefits, we really wanted ecosystem services. Seawalls do not provide any ecosystem services. There's no life in front of a seawall. And all of them are cheaper than a seawall, as I mentioned. And I'll just say this, they're self-sufficient over time. They're very weak in the beginning. As was noted before, those plants need to be taken care of and added to, but that's all you need to do and you're done. And with that, I wanted to put this in. What was the lessons learned? They work, and glad to answer questions.
Good to go. And you guys, I'm going to share a microphone. Okay, sorry for the quick delay. So we're going to do a Q&A session now, it's combined. So you can ask any of our panelists a question, but there may be questions that are appropriate for all three of them. I am going to kick us off actually with a couple questions online, and we'll kind of do a little back and forth. And Bridget Washburn, who is at the Conservancy, is going to help me with kind of doing a little back and forth between virtual questions and our audience, our in-person audience. So first, there's a couple questions for Craig. Somebody asked if you could repeat the names of the dune-forming plants. So I'm going to let you do that first and just mention again what the plants are that are really important in terms of dune formation.
Okay. Should I go?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll
Okay.
give you the second part.
There are a number of plant species. One of them is sea purslane. Sorry, thank you. I'm thinking scientific names. Sea purslane is a great one. Iva imbricata or beach elder is another great one. Panicum amarum, that's that silvery looking grass. That's coastal panic grass. There are a number, and I think we have them listed on a website at the Naples Botanical Garden website.
Okay, and that's the kind of resource that we can make sure to get out in some of our channels later on, and we'll make sure to do that. There is also a question about what is the impact of planting dunes in the dry season?
So what is the impact of planting dunes in the dry season? Well, it's been quite an incredible hurricane season. We've had named and unnamed storms that have had impacts. But if you go to the beach and you dig down, when you dig down into that sand, you don't have to get very far before you get to moisture, where there's moist sand. Well, when you plant beach dune plants, one of the things that you do is you actually plant that top of the plant. Typically, you would have the top of the soil level with the top of the sand. When you plant a tree, you don't bury it. But with beach dune plants, you actually bury them as much as 6 inches deep or deeper. And that helps put their roots closer to that groundwater where they will reach for that groundwater. But it also helps to invigorate these plants. They actually thrive, some of them, not all of them, but thrive on being buried by sand. So it invigorates them. So we'll get them to grow. So these plants, as they're planted, this 1 million plants should be able to reach for that water with their well-developed root systems. I've seen the plants that are going in. They've planted about 40,000 a day, the contractor, and they look good. They're mostly root systems. So that's how that works. And hopefully by the spring, if we don't have many big storms, we should start to see that become more lush and growing in. Where are they planted? There's 13 miles of beach dunes, and one of the things that the county is doing as areas come online, as sand is picked up the sand that washed inland. As it's moved back out and cleaned and sifted to remove any debris, that plant sand is being placed back on the beach, and it's important to quickly get plants out there to help to stabilize that sand. So instead of starting at one end and moving to the other, they're now doing this in locations where they have sand where it's high enough that it's above winter wave energy. Thank you.
And now I want to open things up for the audience and see if we have some questions for the in-person audience. Bridget's going to have to do a little running around here, but so Linda, we'll get your question in just a second here.
Jenna, you spoke very eloquently about the permitting process and the length of time that it often takes to get the permitting done. So my question to Tom is, Tom, on the processes that you've been using, oyster bags, rocks, and then plants, do you run into the same permitting timelines with your iteration as, say, Chad would or anybody else?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no exceptions. Like Jenna said, that sometimes drives the design because the grant funding has windows, and it's a problem. Really, the regulatory agencies have to figure out a way to change their permitting. I was a regulator, I worked for the state. They're all set up to protect resources, right? There's no in those days, no one was just restoring things. So they really were trying to get them to have it. So when a project comes in like these living shorelines, they shouldn't go through the normal gates. They should have one person pick it and say, oh, this totally is a restoration project or protection. And we're going to fast track it out, right? Because it's grant funded. But there's no way. That's just unfortunate right now. Now, I will say there have been improvements made. The federal government came in with the nationwide in 2017 and reiterated it 2 years ago. And the local counties are doing some stuff. It's the state that has to figure out a way. So unfortunately, we all have to go through that permitting, and it's the most difficult thing to do because I'm spending a lot of money on resources, which I could be putting into the projects just to get a permit.
Yeah. Thank you. And is there anything we can do to effectuate a different outcome here?
I don't know if anything else. We just really need to get folks behind to tell the regulatory agencies there must be a better way. We don't want them to give us exemptions completely, and we don't want them to change their rules, but they can internally decide one person is going to review these and kind of expedite them out. I don't know if you have anything.
I would say, and reach out to your local legislators too. I mean, rulemaking it's due time, right? To start coming back to the table and looking at these regulations and how can they be modified.
Big help there. Thank you very much.
And I will make the point that I think there'll be more digging into some of elements of this conversation throughout the day as well. So certainly this is not the last time we'll talk about it. Bridget, looks like we have a question there.
Really for Chad, this was so inspirational because we're right on the beach there, and we had the sand inundation, and we can't wait to see the planting happen. But we live in a community where people love that tropical green look, and we can't keep putting back these bushes that are and grass that's going to die every time salt water gets in it. So what's your assessment on saltwater resistant grasses and bushes, or do we just need to fight the fight and convince people that a more dune-esque landscaping is the way to go?
Wow, great question. Dunes are really the first part of a holistic look at our coast. And that's a question that we get a lot. What landscaping, we live on the coast, what landscaping can we put in? Because it's not something that we're seeing once every 10 years. We're seeing this now every couple of years. And to replace your landscape every year is not sustainable. We can have a resilient landscape along our coast. So that's something that as the garden works towards collecting more plant material for moving inland from the coast, and we'll be making those recommendations and what can we do to have that resilient landscape in our community, not just in the HOAs, but working with the city of Naples and Collier County as well. So. Some of that plant material is available. It's not been widely used. The question was, is that plant material available? That it's not been widely used. This is a shift where we have to shift code. We need to shift what the landscape architects are comfortable with using because quite often they rely on what's always worked. We need to get the growers to grow them and make them available. The companies that manage those need to learn, how do I manage this new form of landscape? It's a little bit different. It can be more hands-off in many instances. So education is again, I kept going back to that. Education is a huge part of that. It's not just educating our community, it's educating the decision makers, the law and policy makers, the landscape architects, the engineers, the land managers, everybody in the room, and bringing everybody to the table. So hopefully by the end of today, we can all go back and speak to those organizations that we work with. So thank you. And we can talk afterwards as well.
So I have a couple questions that came in online that are more on the living shoreline side. And I'm going to give you both of them because I think they're sort of interlinked in some ways. And I think probably Tom and Jenna will speak to this. But the first was from somebody asking if you would recommend on a property that is on open water with consistent scour, would you recommend that they remove a seawall and plant their shoreline? And then I think kind of paired with this is there funding for private property owners to receive funding for living shorelines? And I know Tom thinks about the public-private piece of things, so.
To the first question, yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no one size fits all, but I think depending on the site conditions, even with scour being present, particularly at an existing wall location, that's kind of a standard thing a common theme that we tend to see. So I do think that, that doesn't mean that wouldn't be suitable for a living shoreline or a hybrid nature-based type of solution for stabilization. The second component in terms of grant funding opportunities for private properties, I work more so on the public sector, the local government sector, so I'm not as familiar with some grants for private owners.
Right, and Jenna's right. Most of this funding, when it comes to public money, it comes to public property, right? It's simpler. But I started the nonprofit so we could do P3s, public-private partnerships. So working with Jenna on a property on a site where we have 3 private landowners, and yet we got public funding to design a living shoreline there because the city's property is commingling with it. But you can still do work on private land with public dollars. It's just a little bit more difficult. First of all, you're going to have a conservation easement placed over that. You can't have some new owner come in and rip it out, right? Spend public dollars on it. So there are hurdles like that, but they're doable. So I wouldn't say that you can't get funding at a private residence or a private institute even with public dollars, as long as you understand that there are conservation easements and you got to do some of the maintenance and just participate. But in the end, the birds and fish don't care who owns it, right? So we should not care. We should put in the right solution wherever it's needed.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm going to see if yeah, I think that'll be our last question there. So.
I'm not sure this is Chad or Jenna, but the last storms showed how mobile the sand is. And I don't know if you can comment because I know the sand is being trucked in from internal sources and the specifications make a gorgeous beach. But without aggregate and everything else from an engineering standpoint, are we sacrificing any sort of stability as a result of it because so much sand got pushed with the last hurricanes?
That's been a question we've heard a lot about, was the quality of the sand that's being used. And as I mentioned, it's 4.5 million cubic yards that we've done to date since 1996. And we're going to keep going forward into the future and need more and more and more sand continuously unless we start to really address this. I can't necessarily speak to the quality of sand, but if we get the plants in, the plants that we are proposing for this, the native plants that should be on the beach dune, they don't care about the quality of sand, and they actually will begin to very quickly, as we in some of the images, they'll hold that sand in place and they'll begin to trap more native sand and continue to build that dune. And as they build that higher and taller and their root structures grow into that, they will help to hold that more in place. I don't know what the quality of sand has been used over time and how that impacts in terms of coastal geomorphology. But I do know that if we get the plants in, the plants will grow. We've seen them growing in areas that are almost like concrete, and they do all right. So they will help to abate any issues that might be along with that. Thank you.
Okay, great. So first of all, can we, a round of applause for our speakers. I think this was a really great way to start to show some real world implementation of some of these concepts, of starting to kind of dig into those conversations and what questions people have. So I'm really thankful for a great first session. We're going to transition over to a break for everybody. So that's for people in the room and for people online. So hopefully people online have some good tea or something in their cabinets or in their break room. But what we're going to do is we're going to come back for 11:25 is when we're going to start the panel discussion. So again, get up, stretch your legs, and we will be back shortly.